Are you going to do the introduction? Or?
You want me?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for being here. This is a great event. Thanks for Tom for hosting it.
Hello.
So we'll have, hello.
Hi.
This is Alice, one of our respondents.
Oh, I'm
Hi, Alice.
Hi guys, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, we're just starting, so I'm just doing the introduction. So, yeah, if you get echoes, let me know. If not, that'd be fine. Okay?
Okay, there's a slight echo, but you're intelligible.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for joining us. This is After Representation, Genres of Sense. This is kind of coming out of many different things. One is 2 different New Center for Research and Practice courses, actually. So I'm Yanick. I'm one of the organizers of the New Center, along with Ben Woodard and Tom McGlynn. Both Ben and I taught seminars, and Tom taught his own seminar at the Center. He taught one, Tom taught a course, Aesthetics and the Generic, and Ben and I taught a course on fiction and hyperstition and possible world theory. So as we kind of began discussing and bridging our ideas, we came up with this talk as sort of a way to collaborate with each other while we're in New York. So the way that we're going to basically work the talk is we'll do short panel discussions. Yvette Granata is also here with us, and I'll introduce her when she responds. She's one of our respondents. Thank you for being here. Also, which we already know, Alice is here with us. She'll be showing one of her films and speaking a little bit about her film. And Jason Adams, which you all in here saw, he is available as well. He'll do a response as well. So we'll do very short talks, and then we'll go into discussion afterwards.
Do you have the intro for me?
So. I apologize. I didn't know you wanted me to introduce you.
No, yeah, I thought that's why you wanted me to send you it. So.
No, yeah. So Tom McGlynn is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, and independent curator based in the New York area. His work is represented in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, the Smithsonian, among other national and international institutional collections. He's contributor writer of Brooklyn Rail, most recently a review of the Frank Stella retrospective at the Whitney, and he maintains the poetry blog Seeing the Same. He is also the founding director of Beautiful Fields, an organization dedicated to socially engaged curatorial projects. A recent project, Memphis Social, was awarded a franchise grant from the New York-based organization supporting independent curatorial projects, Apex Art. And he presented a seminar on generic aesthetics, which is for the New Center in the spring of 2015. He has curated Plain Sight, a group show of NYC artists based upon generic aesthetics, which will be opening in Western Michigan University on January 14th, 2006. He's also a lecturer at Parsons New School. So,
Thanks for the introduction, and I want to thank Ed Keller for helping us secure this this venue. I'm just going to get right into it because we started a little bit late. Like Tony said, I did a seminar on the generic last spring, and I welcome the opportunity to kind of riff on that and continue that kind of inquiry in a kind of collaborative way, like Tony said. So thanks guys. This is a great opportunity. My talk's called The Generic Turn, the Hammer of Aesthetics. I'm an artist, so I'm basically an aesthetician. I'm not a philosopher. So I'm coming at it from that point of view. I'm going to start with a Rancière quote from his book, Mute Speech. And in it, he's talking about fiction and genres and the generic. A fiction belongs to a genre. A genre is defined by the subject represented. The subject takes its place in a scale of values that defines the hierarchy of genres. There is no generic system without a hierarchy of genres. Determined by the subject represented, the genre defines the specific mode of representation. The generic principle thus implies a third principle, which we will call the principle of decorum. The poet who has chosen to represent gods rather than bourgeois, kings rather than shepherds, and has chosen a corresponding genre of fiction, must give his character actions and discourses appropriate to the poem's genre. The principles of decorum is thus in complete harmony with the submission of elocutio to the invented fiction. The tone or key of the discourse is determined by the particular state and situation the person is in at the time he is speaking. The problem is not one of obeying rules, but of determining modes of suitability. Decorum is something that is felt. I just wanted to start with that quote because he's talking about genre's end sense. He ends with decorum as something being felt, and I'll continue on that thread. Artists or aestheticians or workers of the aesthetic will often strive towards a naive empiricism in order to avoid a merely illustrative or representational metaphysics. Artists or philosophers are at their best when they resolve to be mere technicians of the metaphysic, mere being an important qualifier there, in order to avoid the reproduction of a determined hierarchy of the generic. Artists can actually use the merely generic as a form of naive empiricism that has the rhetorical power to transcend the reproduction of generic hierarchies. The rhetorical power or feltness of the generic resides in the principle of decorum. To condense and paraphrase Rancière, there is no generic system without a hierarchy of genres. The genre defines the specific mode of representation. Decorum is something which is felt. Inside of Rancière's definition of the generic hierarchy and its conventional proprieties contain the coaxial necessity of the expressive utterance that rhetorically conveys that propriety. This expressive utterance or feltness of generic propriety is in effect an expression of immanence. This expression of immanence can be technically manipulated to yield new meanings not necessarily proper to a given generic system or hierarchy of genres. The generic can retain a strongly rhetorical sense of decorum, yet also simultaneously become a vehicle of radically newer senses of immanence. A radical definition of generic aesthetics is not alloyed to the reproduction of a hierarchy of genres, but to the redeployment of the generic as an underdetermined syntactical plane that can express a radical sense of immanence. By deploying generically, artists can access a Deleuzian plane of pure immanence. And here's Deleuze's definition of that plane. It is only when immanence is no longer immanence to anything other than itself that we can speak to the plane of immanence. So I have this, the first slide is this Venn diagram of a Venn diagram, both illustrative of the generic, but also something that only represents itself. And it'll become clear later on why that's up there, but it's an obviously generic image. So the decorum of the generic can be redeployed as an expressive voice of pure immanence. A good example of, I'll give a couple examples. A good example of the expressive redeployment of generic decorum or conventional propriety is seen in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Eliot effectively performed a hollowing out and ventriloquism of Roman Catholic catechism in order to exploit the expressive immanent elocutio of the decorum anticipated by the hierarchy of that religious genre. He did this in order to technically, perhaps artificially, revive what he perceived as the exhaustive rhetorical power of poetry in his time. Eliot's aesthetics were essentially, ironically, a faithless inquiry into rhetorical power of fidelity to a generic form of faith. I'll pick up this curious operation of the merely rhetorical and the faithless fidelity to the form later on in my discussion of Laruelle's aesthetics. I know that's a little bit like a pretzel. The practice of a weak empiricism and aesthetics that are kind of a bit of a faithless inquiry into a genre can yield newer, more radical aesthetics. Another more contemporary example of the redeployment of the expressive potential of generic decorum can be found in the visionary religion of Jamaican Rastafarianism, which basically hacked its emancipation narrative out of a chapter and verse from the colonially inherited King James Bible in order to instantiate their own African messianic figure in the form of the late Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, who was alive at the time at the inception of the religion. Both Eliot's virtually sanctified lyricism and the speculative realism of the Rastafarian creed can be viewed as radically creative reassignments of pre-existing generic forms. Other examples of artist use of the generic might include Katerina Fritzsch's recent use of generic kitschy life-size castings of religious and mythic figures that interrogate the history of sculpture in general, and Hito Sterl's deployment of the mere syntax of mediated culture to comment critically on that culture. What is relevant here in my introduction of Rancière's definition of the generic and the examples of the aesthetics tactics of the generic I've given is that they're highly creative enactments of the speculative real, or fictions are animated by a phenomenal felt expression. What is also perhaps even more important in my subsequent discussion of the deployment of generic aesthetics is that this speculative real has the potential to achieve a virtual plane of immanence by means of a merely technical metaphysics. This technical metaphysic doesn't necessarily have to carry out the representational proprietary baggage of any hierarchy of genres. Additionally, the technical manipulation of the proprietary expectation of decorous expression attributed to a generic form can phenomenally engage and activate the radical agency of, in Rancière's terms, the emancipated spectator. This technical manipulation frees the rhetorical power of the generic without replicating any specific modes of representation and their attendant scale of values relative to a specific hierarchy of genres. The non-specific use of the generic, in other words, can contain specific radical meaning. Let me return to a short description of how the speculative real and the generic principle have played out in contemporary continental philosophy in order to understand why the terminology genres of sense, which was given to us by Ben, makes sense as a viable philosophical concept. From there, I will conclude with how to play an underdetermined or generic, how the play of underdetermined or generic forms might contain a phenomenologically activated aesthetics. As contemporary theories are being cleaved toward speculative fictions, one has to question whether this drift is a productive disentanglement from prior philosophical and political representations, or simply a reactive, perhaps even regressive, illusion of a traditionally discursive epistemology towards a kind of separatist, pre- or periontic idealism. Speculative realisms are a kind of fictive physics, ostensibly deriving their conceptual momentum by supposedly piercing traditional correlationist constructs of object relations between humans and their worlds, physical or virtual. The critique of correlationist thinking in the work of Quentin Melissu and in the early contributions of Ray Brassiere and others was propelled by a will towards exposing the inherent anthropomorphic blind spot of this conceptual conceit that accords disproportionate value to human ontological projection at the impoverishment of the sense of the material world. The speculative real, therefore, at least theoretically, consists of a more potentially sincere approach towards being, one that might dissolve representational mediations between humans and their environment. On the surface, concerned with the objective, speculative realism is yet a highly mediate and rhetorically determined metaphysic. It heralds an indeterminate advent of the virtual that would enable the mapping of imaginative worlds, which might constitute an emancipatory social and political dynamic, or at the very least, a visionary aesthetics. Does the speculative real sustain its heightened metaphysic, material being sense as phenomenally resistant and resilient to subsumption by shallowly idealized, perhaps Neoplatonic forms of the abstract universal, or do we need new terms that delve deeper into the possibilities of transversality, such as those of Francois Laruelle's generic? Is Laruelle's generic just a new form of Neoplatonic idealism, or does it offer a truly alternative aesthetics of the ideal that can turn one towards material being as sense? I propose to briefly delineate the aesthetic differences between the often contradictory logic of the speculative real and the often confusing ideological dispersal of the generic in order to weigh their respective use values in developing genres of sense as an aesthetics. Speculative realism's influence on contemporary aesthetics is to propose a replacement of human relations to objects, and perhaps even the philosophical incantation of art objects as metaphors for the human, with an egalitarian metaphysics of sheer objecthood, a kind of atomized space grid of phenomena which includes the human as simply another object in its firmament. Melissu has deployed the term arch fossil in order to describe a pre-human, pre-ontic objecthood that virtually exists as a given without its givenness having been bestowed by human projection. His take on the speculative real is therefore an anti-phenomenological in the Husserlian definition, yet paradoxically rests upon his own speculation or ontological projection of a world without being, human being. Speculative realism is therefore, to my mind, much more viable as an aesthetics rather than as a philosophically consistent ontology, since one can't practically know of the ontology of objects other than as the great outdoors of a metaphorical being of sense. I'm an artist and therefore an aesthetician, or the a worker of the aesthetic. An artwork is generally perfectly ideally useless apart from its qualified objecthood as a metaphorical projection. And artists for centuries have been aware of the stubborn phenomenological, in Merleau-Ponty's definition of the phenomenological resistance of materials, stone, pigments, canvas, oils, to being mere vessels for metaphoric transformation. Artists in this sense have been speculative realists all along, but also ideally archly aware of not falling for their own projections, lest their virtual worlds be drained of a qualified conditional objecthood or an as-real that transcends both representation and abstraction. Speculative philosophers, as philosophers, cannot afford this kind of undecidable object-oriented ontology since they don't necessarily participate in the performative step of literally shaping the virtual sentience of the underdetermined object or the object of art. Objects withdrawing unto themselves is nothing new for artists whose often quixotic goal is to approximate just that. An object that could conceivably exist without a determined beginning or end, without the ratification of the representational human. Art making is inherently speculative realism, and speculative realism should be considered, to my mind, as a way of making art, rather than as a viable philosophical method. Francois Laruelle's approach to the neo-metaphysics is more nuanced in its reinvention of human ontological projection, yet often quite confusing in its attitude towards Platonic idealism and/or a non-philosophical approach to the ideal versus the real. Laruelle, in fact, never explicitly makes an appeal to realism, but rather he proposes his own brand of the speculative real based on how the history of human ontology actually works in pluralized worlds of experience. In this universal plurality, or in the context of this panel, transversality of being, he is indebted to Deleuze and his concept of the plane of immanence that can contain all difference. Laruelle's emphasis on the generic categorical approach to human experience and to philosophical conjecture tends to minimize the role of a correlationist humanity, but not completely deny it. In his writing, Laruelle undermines his role as a fictive author and rather generously exhorts the reader to iterate his or her own cora of the real, or iterations of being. The reader of Laruelle is asked to instantiate his or her own real in relation to Laruelle's underdetermined genre of non-philosophy. The generic for Laruelle is not so much a banal empty vessel, but a situation of possibility for the performance of the real. This is why his concept of the clone is relevant. Laruelle's clones are not copies of the real, but simultaneously alongside the real in a reality of their own. One might humorously deride Laruelle's readers as his clones, but in reality, that's exactly what the author is asking of his readers, to enact their own real according to a non-standard philosophy of being. One could aptly characterize Laruelle's non-philosophical actant as periontic, as a periontic being, or an ontology of the subject around the real. I kind of coined this term periontic with the prefix of peri, meaning around the ontic, to kind of deal with how Laruelle approaches the real. Laruelle's non-standard philosophy can also be seen as a useful aesthetics, which is generally what I tend to do, in that it retains a certain lightness of being based on its structural reorganization of the entry points of ontological perception. His approach has been critiqued as a naive empiricism, but it is exactly this weakness which constitutes the resiliency of his method. His approach to philosophy is not to lose faith in it, but to investigate it as faithlessly as possible. Laruelle is enacting here Kierkegaard's aphorism that aesthetics is the most faithless of all sciences. Why is this important in relation to contemporary aesthetics? It's important, I think, because the surfaces and matrices of contemporary representations and language and imagery presupposes a relation to reality that supposedly grounds their flights of fancy and desire in actionable information, when really they are as faithless and indeterminate as the abstractions of much contemporary art practice. Given this landscape of mediated experience, a virtually applied aesthetics can be useful in actively delineating the representational from the phenomenal, the virtual from the real, and the hybrid forms of social representation from the phenomenal elocutions of the real. Situational awareness of the overdetermined social forms of mediated culture as given genres of sense can induce a call for decorum or elocution of those mediated forms in a phenomenal way that can override the virtual power to repress phenomenological agency. Known social determinations are the source of customary knowledge and could be considered genres in and of themselves. Therefore, the social can be technically retooled as an aesthetic that could empower an ideology of social practice. And Mackenzie Wark talks a lot about this in his resurrection of Bogdanov's concept of the prolet cult in Molecular Red. When social determinations are perceived as pure genre, then they can be redirected by an underdetermined logic of being that doesn't necessarily correlate to a traditionally determined ethos, which can liberate one to think in physical phenomenological terms, or to paraphrase Wark, invoke the philosophy of hammerers. Artists are aestheticians and therefore workers of the speculative real. When this underdetermined logic of being is perceived as a mere aesthetic, it can productively mobilize a whole array of sliding signifiers. A mere generic aesthetic would be mobile enough to circumscribe the virtual worlds, foreclosing our experience of the real in our hyper-mediated and hyper-objectified world. The simple, faithless hammers of generic aestheticians can productively reshape, beyond mere representation, the opaque mug of an increasingly repressive and administered contemporary culture. Thanks.
So since I have the bios, should I talk to them?
Yeah, you might as well. Do you have it in front of you? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so next here, we'll have Ben Woodard. So then I'll introduce Ben. Ben is a recent PhD graduate in theory and criticism from the Western University. His doctoral work focused on the relationship between idealism, pragmatism, and naturalism in Schelling. He is an instructor at the New Center of Research and Practice, an associate of the Laboratory for Ontology, the UK branch, and the co-founder of PS, a philosophy collective at the Performing Arts Forum in Saint-Ouen-Reims.
Thanks.
Cool.
Okay, and did you put the quotes up?
Yes, I can.
Thank you, John.
So
Okay, so I'm just going to talk really briefly about some of the work I'm trying to do now, which is basically how you do idealism after naturalism. And that idealism is not the cartoon version of it that most people think it is, basically. So I'm going to read these quotes, but I'm going to read them kind of fast, and since they're long, I just figured to put them up there. So the first one is from a recent interview with Ray Brassier. Shorn of its rational constraint, the banner of realism by itself becomes strictly meaningless. In fact, relations between realism, materialism, and idealism are of considerable dialectical complexity. I think it's a mistake to brandish any one of them in isolation from the others. They derive whatever philosophical sense they possess from their contrastive interdependence. Just as the assertion of an unqualified or indiscriminate realism is uninformative, the proclamation of materialism has also become meaningless, a genuflection to academic orthodoxy, often licensing positions that are indistinguishable from the most objectionable theses of idealism. So the quote above suggests a deeper problem with the contemporary articulation of idealism. Far more than realism or materialism, idealism is defined in a negative sense, as being not materialism or not realism, or even more strongly, that it is the thesis that reality is actually constituted by thoughts, or an absolute thought, or that only our thoughts matter. These two sentiments are generally classified as the ontological and methodological versions of idealism. More fairly, however, we should say that the ontological thesis of idealism is that the world is composed of non-substantive properties, which we experience as mental qualities, calling it will, spirit, mind, etc. Similarly, the methodological form of idealism appears little in kind, if at all, different from various forms of constructivism, perspectivism, and the like. Hence, the claim that the world is likely to be made of processes, which we have indirect access to, is an idealist position, but is one that hardly fits the polemical or dismissive definition that idealism is generally attached to. As Brassier's quote above suggests, this may be because materialism, having lost much, if not all, of its definitional rigor, particularly if its definition is sundered from any scientific basis, idealism becomes a synthesis of a straw man and a scapegoat. So I call this the straw goat, like in a bad attempt to be funny, upon which materialism and idealism defines itself via negation. Beyond allowing for lazy border keeping for realism and materialism, allowing idealism to be defined in such a way not only crudely examines idealism, but also misaligns the history of philosophy, and in particular, the passage between critical idealism, absolute idealism, objective idealism, not to mention the forms of process philosophy which stretch between pragmatism and idealism. But before explaining the point too much, it would be better to focus on a particular case of the strong sense of idealism, vis-a-vis materialism and realism. And for the emphasis of this particular talk, to talk about the hard case for any realism, or materialism, which, as the idealist Bernard Bosanquet put it, was aesthetics. In his 1913 lecture entitled Mind and Its Objects, Bosanquet speaks of a new realism, represented by Samuel Alexander at the time. So this is like, early 20th century, in which in this new realism, the claim which Bosanquet borrowed from James Hinton was that the world was dark, cold, and shaking like a jelly, waiting for secondary qualities to apply to it by minds. New realism attempts a far more powerful case for mind independence. One of the more basic claims that Bosanquet makes is that the appeal to facticity, or the facthood of a fact, the fact that facts do not immediately make strong ontological claims, but seem true, is an important advance of the new realism. And thus, Bosanquet argues that mind is never on one side with things, the mind isn't on one side with things on the other, but that the mind is a factual environment of action. It kind of argues that the new realists actually help idealism by saying facts are self-standing or facts are self-justifying. So he claims that this is actually an advancement for realism and idealism simultaneously, even though the realists are claiming to advance against idealists. So this is the second quote. When I am told that I must not confuse an idea as a mental act with an idea as a content of sense or an object of thought, oops, that's messed up. I think I understand what is meant. When I am told that the content of sense or object of thought may therefore be something quite non-mental, or even physical, I am, to speak plainly, inclined to feel myself the victim of sophistry. It seems obvious at first sight that a blue is as physical as a pain, or as an inferential transition. And although you may argue at length that it is nothing but an external object, I feel that all the time I am being defrauded. You have put the vital character of a certain experience into what you call an act, and I admit that it is especially observable in connection with a certain function. But now you tell me that the main thing in the object, what I value in it, and what I want it for, is removed and abolished by the distinction, and the experience as such is left for dead. His claim is, of course, not that mental actions and things experienced are purely in the mind, but he says to claim that the way in which we get to grips on something, that can be, that either should be sundered from, or defined by the fact of the thing, or by the physical theory of the thing. He thinks that doesn't account for why a subject and object, or even two objects, or two anythings are interacting in a way that, gains something from the interaction. He thinks the new realism of the time, it's kind of scientific realism, which will be called later, doesn't account for that adequately. Okay, and so this is a passage, this is a much more recent passage. I'll say what's from after. One might object, and we shall see it later, that philosophy has never denied the existence of a world out there, and this is largely true. Indeed, some philosophers have done worse. They have pictured a world with no form, qualities, or properties, a sort of cookie dough, for subjects able to make it shape, meaning, and use. The world manifests a direction of use, a sense of flow, calls us, gives us possibilities and positivities, and gives us something that is given, not merely thought of. After all, this is the other side of pragmatism, which had the merit of insisting that our relationship with the world is not only cognitive, but involves an action on the part of the subject. The latter, in turn, does not merely contemplate the world, but uses resources, seeks solutions, transforms situations. The fact that this action is possible depends on reality, which calls for us. But I hope there's you can see some similarity in the structure of the arguments being made, and not just in terms of a shaking jelly and cookie dough, but that's kind of funny that worked out. But the idea that there's an extra action needing to take place. But the second quote is from Rizo Ferraris's forthcoming book, Positive Realism. And Ferraris is someone who claims to be a new realist. Of course, this new realist is a new realist of the last 5 years, and not the new realist that Bosanquet is talking about in the 19-teens. What's interesting here is that, in this 100-year time span, you have a very similar structural argument. Whereas the former defends idealism from new realism, the second defends a different new realism from constructivism or bad idealism. How is it that Bosanquet is historically considered a rampant idealist, while Ferraris is considered an incredibly cautious? Bosanquet is considered a rampant idealist, while Ferraris is considered a moderate realist. The situation appears as if two isolated forces are battling in a war that has long ended, but neither side knows. Bosanquet's idealism simply asserts that experiencing is an enveloping function, and thus experience is an act of enveloping or nesting actions according to the immanent rules of the space thus enveloped. So the idea that the world isn't made of thoughts, but that, thinking about thoughts is what idealism thinks about. Right? And the idea is that, to not push that too far, the idea is that realism, materialism, idealism have their domains of operation. It's not about those domains overtaking everything. It's that you act in certain situations as if those theories can obtain on a broad sense, and then you work out the parts where the theory breaks down. So in this sense, the status of representation shifts away from one of obtaining on the real and to one of making sense of it in the way it's present to different levels of sense and understanding. In this regard, we can view how Brassier's statement, the quote at the beginning, is not merely trivially stating that realism, materialism, and idealism are equally valid, but that the contrasted interdependence says something about the very nature of doing philosophy, not merely in a sociological sense of getting along. It's not merely that all these things are valid equally, but that the way in which they fight with each other actually adds something to each of them. So if we are childishly reductive and say either that there is thought, idealism, there is stuff, materialism, or there is structure, realism, we would have to say that there is thought about stuff, stuff that thinks, structure that is made of stuff, and so on, in order for any of those positions to be philosophical positions. Otherwise, there would only be thought about thought, stuff that's stuffed, or structures that's structured. And if that was the case, we probably wouldn't be arguing so much all the time. Or there wouldn't be a recognizable difference. What is, and how we talk about what is a relation that is always more co-constituting for our philosophical enemies than it is for us. When we say someone's an idealist, they say they're idealists and they make everything made of ideas. But if someone said that about a realist, they would say, oh no, of course I'm not. There's this weird tension that if you're an idealist, whatever the target is, their ism or their istness makes them blind to the way they're doing their philosophy. So it's like if you're an idealist, you can't even see that you're doing idealism. Or if you're a realist, according to the idealist cartoon, you're not a realist about doing realism. So there's this weird kind of naivete assigned to each other that doesn't make sense. And this is very obvious in the very doing of philosophy itself. The fact that any practitioner of philosophy is at minimum a non-total or non-fundamental instance of philosophizing means that there is a constructive constraint between what we are doing and where we are doing it from. Hence why I think isms and eons, like Deleuzians, whatever, are generally less useful than the articulation of positions. When I defend idealism, I'm not making a constitutive statement about the world, but about the kinds of enveloping the mind does. How to think about the structure, stuff, and thoughts about thoughts. Thus, idealism is a path that does not push out other forms of thinking, but thinks them according to one particular mode. But these modes are not merely networked competitors, but augment the very space of philosophy, or they push each other in a way that expands the outer boundary of thought on all of their terms. Idealism manifests its particular power, I think, especially now, in fictionalism and figuralism. I'm talking about possibility and impossibility. Only in a world where those things were only in our heads, and if being in our heads only meant they affected things in our heads, would idealism ever amount to naive idealism. At the risk of ending on a really cheery note, this idea of idealism and this kind of basic structure which it investigates is really evident in a story within a story. Its function. And so this idea that even within a story, a basic idea, a seemingly only fleeting idea, has a very particular structural effect. So Anton de Saint-Exupéry understood this well, in that seemingly trivial ideal statement, even in a desert landscape of the mind as only mind, the story within a story, and that it can provisionally populate the world with something that does not remain there, because there is no merely mind in mind, but that it can, at the very least, have a constructive aesthetic effect. So this is from The Little Prince. Yeah, I'm quoting Little Prince. It works. Here, then, is a great mystery. For you who also love The Little Prince, and for me, nothing in the universe can be same if somewhere we do not know where a sheep that we never saw has yes or no eaten a rose. Look up at the sky, ask yourselves, is it yes or no? Has the sheep eaten the flower? And you will see how everything changes. Hence why Bosanquet claims that, and this is his thesis about idealism most fundamentally, everything is real so long as you do not take it for more than it is. To take something as more than it is to make a secluded world of only things. That's it.
Do you want to read my bio?
Sure.
Which I don't actually have.
Would you like me to introduce you?
I don't have it in front of me, but I don't.
Yeah, well, I prepared everybody's bios except for myself.
Okay.
So, it's no problem. I'm an organizer in New Centric Research and Practice. I am a PhD student at Glasgow University doing cinema studies, but also interested in the intersection between philosophy and image. I also have been interested lately in the worlds of fiction, philofiction, and its engagement with media archaeology or film art. So I will just be trying to basically I built a bunch of notes in order to try to connect these two seemingly disparate talks and try to see how I might be able to make a relation to get a discussion going between everybody. So I just wanted to briefly just discuss the Laruellean concepts of philofiction, discuss the generic a little bit, and then introduce the transversal by way of Laruelle superpositions. So in Laruelle's practice, he's striving to create sort of a genre of thinking or genre of sense, which we were talking about, that would be close enough to or close to science fiction. This is commonly related. And what he's using here is philosophy as it's a philofiction. It's not a fiction of philosophy or something. It's actually so he uses this in the form of experimental theoretical applications and is components for his use of superposition as number. And then we also get conceptual persona. Has at its base, it's very poetic, it's very abstract, and so these are the sort of fictional elements of his work. It's performative, so fiction in the sense is very similar. It's very akin to art in the way that I would consider it here. Or with generic science or art and philosophy. So he's taking sort of dualisms and then overlaying them, or using this fictional element to sort of blur the boundaries between the two and create something new. So also this, which I'll bring up his fictional method is also a way to undo philosophy or any sort of transcendental laws have. So what philofiction is theorizing without any constraints to borders of authority, just theorizing and letting it go. This is a very weak definition of it, but I'm going to throw it out to make it sort of apparent. So philosophy Deleuze this way. And each sort of method, especially with photography and when he's doing method, except for with the Deleuzian Spinozist method, like with Francis Bacon, when he's discussing Bacon, creating these concepts are being created alongside it's producing a new kind of thought in a similar way. So there's a weird criticism here that Laruelle potentially is assuming parallel concepts alongside of, say, Terrell or with light. So that's one thing that I find a relation, but could be I could be wrong. So from Laruelle, based on philofiction, before I move on to the generic, is from two quotes from Philosophy from Univocal Press in 2013. So, what is being investigated here is not a particular philosophical position of fiction in relation to the real, but philosophy's legislation or right. So, the other one I wanted to say is that it's an experimental practice of conceptual possibilities, or to weaken or depotentialize philosophical. And all of these times that he's defining and over all things. That is immanent to itself, or to the thing, to the materials of philosophy, to photography. So it's not creating an other world or a possible world or these. Just already strongly but clumsily fictional, a shameful fiction object as a function of its property. So the generic. So Laruelle's conceptualization of the generic, at least 2011, he has sort of a weak form of intervention here, and it's not. So around this time, it's not founded by any sort of radical transversal practice like we see in Guattari or Foucault's method of diagonalism. Unilateral, and I want to try to argue that we can still discuss this sort of transversal. Because Tom did a great job with the generic. I don't want to define any of this in a way, but the generic is in which he makes it, which he depotentializes such a thing. So it's a transformation of subject of the last instance, Laruelle quote. Permanent if we talk about Laruelle's insufficiency. Sorry. From Keith Tilford, who's here, Art Science and Laruelle, which was actually also given with Tom. Keith makes a relation between Badiou and Laruelle in both of their generic extensions. And he says, this is one way in which non-philosophy attains its status as simultaneously a generic science and a science fiction, as the former consistently deploys the latter's tropes of futurity and possible worlds, populating with enigmatic technological devices whose function is to provide an image of the world, unquote. I just love this quote, and I wanted to quote him because he's here. But we have this sort of to philofiction and science fiction. So one way, am I running over? No. Okay, so I'll say one more thing about the, okay. So one way we can generalize aesthetics or in this way, the arts in itself retains its autonomy from philosophy. Philosophy does not, and philosophy positive things into generic elements is in a paradox, keep them separated. Just that, so one is not overarching the other. So these are so these are basically models and their autonomy according to Laruelle. Modeling. And so what is the one last thing about the generic science is, and how would generic science relate to the aesthetics? We have one thing. If Galloway in a superpositions conference recently, he describes this as the thing that is immanent vis-a-vis the real. So he says that science is always direct or radical, not reflected or mediated. It's a science that reveals things immediately, unilaterally. Oh, this is what always happens. Sound interruption during my refers to non-philosophy as a science of philosophy. He means simply that it focuses on philosophy's radical or irreflective immanence, not its penchant for the transcendental. Whereas philosophy is the thing that is transcendental, vis-a-vis the real. So for Laruelle, we have philosophy versus science, philosophy as a transcendental. Sorry, Jason. So yeah, at this point, I've just based the question here is now, how might I be able to bridge this? With Laruelle, you have the superposition of one overlaying over the other, superposed over the other. And yeah, all right, so. All right, so recently Zalmay gave a lecture series at the Pratt Institute in New York City. I think it was a month or two ago. And so his concept of transversality, I think, really will give us some insight into this. So if I could borrow a little bit from these lectures, some of the things that he was saying, he's defining through mathematics that there's a common trend in many different thinkers through philosophy and philosophy of mathematics, in which there's this sort of between the ideal and the real, or invention and or in Michel Serres, it's an invention and discovery of homotopic mixtures. He also cites functionality by Langlands. PFC moderation by Shella, index theorem, quantization, H principle, on and on and on. So there's this constant relationship between, or that's happening in mathematics, where this transversal mediation is consistently happening. And this too. And he's saying it's a sheafification or transversality, or transversal, is analysis or synthesis of polarity, thus gives rise to a new web of epistemological perspectives in accordance with the directions of contemporary mathematics. And diagonalism, just sort of put forth to the two panelists and to the responders is if perhaps Laruelle's transversality or Laruelle's superpositions is not quite the transversal, like say Guattari, which is more related to subjectivity, more related to maybe from falling into that, and think of transversality, which is considered commonly in mathematics as a generic formulation, and that's what I'm trying sort of new defense of idealism outside of this straw goat, as he says it. So because I back on those. So we can bring Yvette. You want to come? Would you like to, or you want Jason to go first, or?
I can, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, she'll grab my microphone. So we're going to now begin start with her. We'll then go to Jason Adams, and then Alice we will have
Sorry to
go
interrupt,
by
but
really quickly.
I can't hear hardly anything coming from that room at the moment. Is there anything that you can do about that?
There's a multimedia design workers, Tribeca Film Fest, Rotterdam, Cannes, Berlin, Rome, and CPH and PIX, amongst others. Her media artwork has been exhibited in New York, Amsterdam, Detroit, Cuba, Boston, and Salta.
Forgot the city. Oh, thanks. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly who is best to direct it at. I think probably Laurel, and I like what Tony said. Laurel does something non-philosophy and the radical subtractions or divisions, and using generic forms in different mixed ways, which is something that you mentioned is something that art has done for a long time. But also allows us to think similarly about the way that art might also offer an alternative aesthetic of the real And so what I think it does, though, to have Laruelle, so if art's been doing this forever, what does it help to have Laruelle? I think it's because having Laruelle do this with philosophy, it gives us an ability to look, again, at the methodologies of art practices and art objects and aesthetics as material in a way that is more rigorous and parallel to the way that he treats philosophical. Of philosophers, but and what is it that we are talking about when we look at art objects? It seems like artists are getting off scot-free a little bit. And I'm saying this as an artist, not criticizing artists. But so for me, I think about not putting art into a privileged position. Is artistic license something that we can the most?
Yeah, I mean, it's continental philosophy's critique of representational, trope. So, like, the representation of the generic, a lot of, when I talk about this, to people who aren't necessarily thinking about it, they automatically think that the generic is like the banal. Like, they think of the definition of the generic as a representational definition. And my interest in Laruelle's approach to philosophy is similar to yours. This can also be, used as an aesthetics. I see Laruelle's philosophy as an aesthetics. That's my heresy. But more importantly for me as an artist, take from primary forms, which in and of themselves could express a generic principle. But if you get into the history of minimalism, it's not really all about a generic principle. There's all these different kind of like representational things subtending like these primary forms. So for me, very interesting to investigate the social. So that's why I give the example of Eliot. T.S. Eliot, which he'd probably see that as a horrible formal way to liberate an expression that he hadn't seen. He hadn't seen in the poetry of his or the non-committed or non-energetic poetry of his time. So in Eliot poem, it's like I'm also at this, and this is around and he's also talking about a rocket phase. He's Catholicism. Not that Eliot's content or his representation I think Laruelle's naive. His method of superposition of, positioning himself outside of the history of philosophy and its representations, and representations. He's also talking about putting himself outside of the tradition of a critique of difference, which is really kind of fascinating for me because, if you think of the representational definition of the generic as everything's the same, there's no difference, it's generic, it's a generic brand, everything's the same. And you think about, his book, Philosophies of Difference and Deleuze, I believe. He's talking about the generic critique of philosophy, but also against the digital. It's also a critique of the representation of a dialectical method you're not just critiquing the representation, but you're also critiquing the structure of the representation. And I thought that
Go. Together. Okay. Artistic method. Look at art practices and art methods. The type of object, a non-disciplinary like the way that she did this. So that the non-disciplinary object is something that combines a lot of different disciplinary realms. So science, algorithms, images, the environment, the social, all these different elements from not any one single discipline. And great, in that they're a part of generating a theory, but they never become a part of the theory itself. So the objects are theory because they're part of generating it. It's something that the model is a tool, but it isn't something that goes into, but will show predictions. And then if actions are taken, what the model's point is to be the idea of the contemporary object that in many fields, so in philosophy, anthropology, geography, big data, all are sort of like bringing in, I think, these like non-disciplinary objects as underdetermined real models. And so thinking about that and the art object, for me, it was a way of kind of doing a non-philosophical method of like bringing down the art object into this like realm of all of these other objects and making the art aesthetics as a material for creating generic objects, which would be in line with all of these other types of objects, which are from many disciplines or non-disciplinary. So I thought, I don't know, I just wanted to ask if the reassignment of generic forms could be something like the title of the talk, presentation. Is that something that think about that, bringing down an art object into a generic object?
I'm not familiar with her work, although from what you say.
Mm-hmm.
The distinction between contemporary objects and art objects, is this similar to, like, is this like a Laruelle's generic science? Would be anything that's a contemporary object? Or?
Well, she's talking about how contemporary objects are non-disciplinary.
Okay.
So an art object is one of those.
So, yes, the moment of after. The title was inspired by dealing with the Laruelle concept of sort of fiction and representation.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing, but trying to.
It's a good question.
Well, I guess I could rephrase it in terms of fiction. So it's like a fictional object as like to not keep the fictional object as in this position of a separate position, but using it as one of many generic. It's a generic object that is next to other generic objects. Modeling the real.
It's a way of modeling, but also it's a way of fiction as a way of sort of like installing past fictional objects or installing things in order to sort of see what kind of agency or change or some kind of description they can have. I think, but I mean, yes, I mean, I think the project would be to do something similar to that. But I mean, the only thing that it would allow is just the fact that fictional thing is this leads to a lot of issues that we were discussing about, like a lot of issues like the hierarchical scheme. Like you need to have a heuristic of a type of fictions potentially. I think for them.
So then you have to talk about the syntax between the objects, between the models, and I think that's what. Kozlover, that's why Kozlover titled her book The Syntax. He talks about maintain a non-representational. It's interesting. Not just those who are representations, metaphors of representations. What I find interesting about, say, like, if the art object is the overdetermined object, object and relational process, moving from the overdetermined, or is it a self-evident immanence underdetermined? So that's why we're showing the diagram of the diagrams. Like, you can't. When I read Laruelle, I think of the phrase that you can't bite your own teeth. He's always forcing you back into reality. Rather than to follow it as a rational philosophy. But I'm getting off your question. But it's a good question, because the overdetermined, if we think about the art object as an overdetermined object, is the generic process of moving from the overdetermined to the underdetermined, and I think this is relevant to your question, is it developing a completely new concept of aesthetics, which is just underdetermined? Move from the overdetermined to the underdetermined, it's almost like you're is to get representation even out of the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm out Laruelle in the room, so I don't really know what I can say about that. Specifically, but I think, part of the reason I think idealism is interesting is, when Laruelle gets some of his certain kind of methodological tricks from idealism. This idea about, again, we talked about this before, this idea of the fact act, the idea that something is like an act of a fact time, something takes repeat time. And so this notion that there is this kind of ability of things to relate to themselves, something he sees, he kind of takes up pretty much instead of saying that things relate to themselves, should instead be kind of split in terms of things relating alongside itself, as opposed to things, instead of this kind of the die of the kind of decisionalism he does instead of saying. Or to please. So, what the difference is between some of the more I think for Laruelle, there's an attempt to sort of, one-up deconstruction, the idea that you can kind of, the one is this container of everything. Whereas sort of, a lot of the use of the fiction, the idea of fiction and fiction and fiction, is to just push the border so far out to space. Like there's no account of that's sort of like pushing someone back to the real. It's like pushing you so far out to the unreal that you're forced back that way. Like things are seen as so fictional disparate, you have to localize and focus on what you're doing as opposed to saying, come back to real, come back to real, come back to real. It's just kind of like it's like going on a bender of reality, back to real, as opposed to this know if that's great. That's even a helpful statement. That's what you said, but I think it's both generic. There's a generic object in both those cases in terms of the basic structure of thinking, but how you relate to it is really different. Not relevant to this.
So, Jason, are you there? Anything else?
Hello?
Hi, Jason. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just getting you on the screen here. Okay, so I'm going to introduce your bio now, Jason, and you can start.
Okay.
Okay, so this is my colleague, Dr. Jason Adams. He's a member of the organizing committee of Youth Center for Research and Practice at the Professor at Campbell College of Art and Design in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He holds 2 PhDs. The first in political science from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, in class of 2010. The second in media communication from the European Graduate School in 2012. Adams has been an invited speaker at the British Columbia Political Science Association in Canada, Deakin University, Australia, University Association. University, also in Greece, Bogota, University of Cincinnati, Hawaii, and Williams College. He publishes regularly in both popular press and academic venues, including national alternative press publications like These Times, Truth Out, and Z Magazine, as well as international academic journals such as Boundary 2, Critical Inquiry, and Radical Philosophy. In 2004-2010, he was managing editor of Johns Hopkins University. Deleuzian Race in Edinburgh, which is Edinburgh Press 13. His first book, Occupied Time, Technoculture, Immediacy, and Resistance After Occupy World 14, was inspired by the occupation movement, which presently Adams is working on a second book, Accelerating Alienation. This is Dr. Jason Adams. Hey, Jason. Hi, Jason. Wireless problems here?
I'm hoping you can. Yeah, if for some reason it does cut out, we can always do a cell phone to speakerphone to microphone connection. But let's try the Hangout and see if it works.
Okay, let's see.
Okay. So just type in the Hangout. I'll have that on the side here in case it doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to start with Tom's. So Tom was talking about how fiction belongs to a genre. There's a hierarchy of genres. This creates a sense of the generic. And I guess my main question in relation to Rancière is one that connects with Deleuze, which he also connected with Deleuze through the concept of pure immanence. And that is, I guess, in the Emancipated Spectator, which in the art form version, there's also the book version, but in the interview with Rancière from Art Forum, he talks about this concept, and he basically says that the whole critique of the spectacle is based on a kind of Platonist distinction of model and copy, and so there's sort of the model which the philosopher kind of actually knows. And then there's the copy, which is what the spectators and kind of the masses are exposed to and mesmerized by. And what I understand that is saying is that is basically saying that that instead of thinking in terms of spectacle, instead of thinking in terms of representation, that actually the critique of the spectacle itself is based in a representational philosophical framework. And so so I guess my question here is, let's see, Tom said, for example, that, are you guys hearing me okay? Are we having interruptions?
It's perfect for me.
Whatever you said, can you hear me? And then you cut out.
So there have been some interruptions, or no?
But we got to your question.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to keep going. So just, if there is an interruption, just type it in the Hangout instead of saying it, because when you speak, I can't always hear you. So I'm not sure even what the answer to my question was that I just asked about whether I was interrupted or not. So please type it and just let me know if I am interrupted. Okay, so Tom said that for Melassu, what he ignores is that we can't practically know time in its non-human form, and therefore the speculative is necessarily the realm of aesthetics. And I think that that's true, but I think that it's also that doesn't mean that it's not real either. Let me just see. Just missed a few words, but we got most of it. Okay, just make sure the question's clear at the end. So, so this idea of Melassu kind of putting forward a concept of a non-human temporality. Yes, we do have to speculate, but also for Melassu, when he's talking about the arc fossil, he's talking about doing that through carbon dating, which is a scientific method of doing so. And so I'm not sure it's only aesthetics. I think that there is an aesthetic dimension to it, but I think that there's also a scientific dimension to it, which can't be divorced from aesthetics, but is still potentially otherwise describable. And one other thing, he also said that Tom also said that phenomenology is the resistance of the material to being mere vessels of something else, coming from Merleau-Ponty. I mean, one question that this to me might ignore is the question of access, and I'm not saying that in a correlationist sense. I'm saying how do we access the material in the first place? And for this, I think that one really good place to go is Deleuze's Cinema 1 at the very beginning on page 58, where he says he actually critiques phenomenology and says instead of going from the a-centered state of things to centered perception, one should go back up towards the a-centered state of things and get closer to it. Broadly speaking, one should do the opposite of what phenomenology put forward. So I think phenomenology is important, but I think that that with Deleuze's kind of cinematic thinking, what it's kind of about is a type of speculative aesthetics. It's basically saying that cinema actually brings us closer to the real or to materiality than embodied perception or embodied consciousness, because embodied consciousness is a filtering mechanism that makes that creates a form of experience that is highly filtered and does not give us access to the real. And so yeah, so I guess my question here is I just want to say one more thing from Deleuze. This is from the afterword to the logic of sense, where he's talking about, and he does talk about representation here, but he also makes a little bit of room for what he calls resemblance. He says that to reverse Platonism means to make the simulacra rise and to affirm their rights amongst icons and copies. The problem no longer has to do with the distinction essence appearance or model copy. This distinction operates completely within the world of representation. So in other words, if we're trying to think beyond representation or after representation, then for sure we're thinking in terms of the simulacral. And the simulacral is itself the real, or it is itself much closer to materiality than any model of model versus copy or essence versus appearance. He says the simulacrum, and this is what he calls the simulacrum, which is also like pure immanence. The simulacrum is not a degraded copy. It harbors a positive power which denies the original and the copy, the model and the reproduction. He says there's no longer any privileged point of view in this perspective except that of the object common to all points of view. So there is an object there, and I do think that there is a particular way of reading Deleuze that is actually like an object-oriented way of understanding what Deleuze means by the simulacrum and what he means by pure immanence. He says that there's no possible hierarchy, therefore no second, no third. Resemblance persists, but it is produced as the external effect of the simulacrum. So resemblance is still there, and so what some people mean when they say representation is still kind of part of that. That framework and that critique. And I think by the same token, if we were to go back to Rancière, when he's critiquing sort of situationist theories of the spectacle, and basically saying that they're Platonist and essentialist, I think also in that case, it's not that we're to talk about the after representation is not necessarily to oppose representation. It's basically to say that representation and the represented are basically the same thing. It's a pure simulacra. So if I'm speaking in New York via Hangout, or if I'm speaking in New York in person, either way I'm still speaking in New York, and it's still accurate that I'm speaking in New York. So I guess my question from all of that, and I'll try to make sure this is clear, although I don't have control over the technical mediation of how well that comes through. But my question is basically, how can we think of an aesthetics after representation that is not that doesn't try to simply oppose representation, but that allows for some concept of resemblance, but a form of resemblance that is produced as the external effect of the simulacrum, as Deleuze puts it, in Logic of Sense. So that there's still some type of representation, and also by the same token, I think in Rancière's critique, there's still some form of spectacle. It's just that spectacle is not a negative thing per se.
Okay. Do you want me to rephrase it?
It's a lot. Yeah, the simulacrum. In the 80s, the simulacrum and Baudrillard's writing was considered kind of an epochal shift in how artists related to art making. I mean, that's when people like Richard Prince and the Pictures generation were appropriating expressions from kind of like an imminent plane of simulacra of cultural reproduction, cultural representations. So I understand that. Like I understand that there's a subtlety to the title of active representation, and I agree with you basically. I think I agree with you. I think a lot of art. I mean, like I said, I'm an esthetician, and you know, we. Artists. Representation. Technology, we're playing with the representationalist stuff. And I think that's, you know, kind of a, maybe not necessarily a new way of doing Orwell's relationship to art making, I think. When I teach painting, I tell my they're not separate. They're simultaneous because paintings have physicality. And I tell them that in order to get away from just optics, but I also tell them that to be aware, and especially in kind of like our mediated culture, when the phenomenal, the tactile is becoming more impoverished in practice and in theory. I do address, you know, the phenomenal aspect of the canvas in relation to the fact that it's a picture in a frame. So I think active representation is kind of like a movement towards a representational thinking that paradoxically includes representational thinking. So I kind of agree with you. As an esthetician, I mean, I think, you know, someone like Richard Rorty would discuss representation as being in the way of, you know, an experience of a kind of pragmatic real, but, you know, that's a whole other kind of. I didn't have my mic.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Is that? Should I move on? Should I move on now to Ben, or no? I couldn't quite hear the very last part.
You agree with you, mostly?
Okay.
I don't know where you went, what the last part was exactly.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Ben then, and probably somebody in the room could respond to Tony's better than I could, just because I couldn't hear significant portions of it. So for Ben's, Ben was talking about Ray Brassier and this. I think Reza Negarestani and a number of other people do this kind of thing as well, which is a really fascinating approach where the argument is that materialism, realism, idealism, and these various types of categories really are all kind of interdependent. We can't really speak of only materialism or only idealism, although the materialist argument, and I'm assuming that part of what's being critiqued here is the new materialist argument, is often that idealism is negatively defined, reality is, and suggests that reality is constituted by thought, or that only thought matters. And I guess my question is, I would agree that happens a lot, and we do see straw goats, as you put it, of idealism that are put forward. But I think we also see straw goats of new materialism as well in many of the responses to new materialism. So I guess my question is, are you able to hear me right now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my question is. But does tearing down the straw goat of idealism itself allow for what is arguably after representation, which is this pure immanence, the simulacrum, truly being beyond model and copy, or or are we going back into the model and copy, or as Badiou puts it, are we going back into the cave in order to bring the people out of the cave? So does tearing down the strago, does it allow for a concept something like the simulacrum beyond model and copy? And could you say more about how new idealism, new realism, and new materialism are really all that distinct? Because to me the question is, isn't the new in each of those three essentially just adding whatever would otherwise be excluded in its absence? So if we say new materialism, the thing that makes new materialism new is that it's not purely materialist. It's that it is partially idealist. And from what I heard you saying about idealism, I would assume that would be the same thing for a new idealism, is that it would have a materialist and a realist aspect to it as well. And I'll just add the second part of my question as well. So it would make sense that new idealism would be more realist and materialist than say, an unqualified idealism. But isn't there a less new version of idealism, an old idealism, that is in fact not too far from the cartoon version? I mean, if it's a cartoon version, then yes, that's not going to be accurate. But isn't there an old idealism that is not up to the task of what you're talking about, which is coming from Brassier? And if so, are you not mapping new idealism back onto old idealism here? And this, I'm sure that with your studies of Schelling, you can easily show that that's not the case. But just thought I would throw that idea out there. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. But you might need you to reiterate a short part in which you missed, but we'll get to it.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. I would say I don't want to claim, I don't want to make a claim or say there's a new idealism. I also just want to say that old idealism is sort of continually misunderstood and misarticulated in a certain way. So to me, it's just, yeah, like idealism has a particular function. It's just a question of articulating what that function is in relationship to what materialism and realism are now as well. So it doesn't have to be a new kind. It doesn't have to be called new. It can just be called idealism. And that there's certain things that idealism can do that materialism and realism can't do as well because of its history. So, and I was thinking about is it just simply a matter of way, or which can be argued with the way new realism is used now by some continental people, or is it that you're actually adding something different that normally wouldn't be considered belonging to that particular form of thinking, which I think is maybe the case with new materialism, since the new materialists have process-based or even mindless tendencies as well. They want to claim that those processes I think the issue there is that that's why being that these isms are so they're interested in this material, this kind of stuff. There. Yeah, and then just in terms of the issue of representation, I think representation is just sort of mind kind of obtaining in a direct or even, mostly direct sense. Obviously, there's a lot of conceptual baggage that goes with representation. just that you can't really get, you can't really get away from Kant on that, I think.
All right, thank you. So I guess we should probably move on to Alice.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Alice.
Okay, great. If I do drop out, I've sent a copy of what I'm about to say, so you could put that on the screen if you like. But I'm just going to read a brief introduction to the film.
Okay.
Tony, do you want to screen and share the film with the group, or how would you like to present it?
I'm going to present it here and then share the, maybe we just share the link.
The link.
For like a day.
Okay, great. So I'll just begin. Okay, so beginning with a quote. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I was going to say, if I could just let me introduce you really quickly.
Oh, sorry, of course. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's really late for her. She's in the UK. She's like 2:30, something like that. So thanks to Alice being. She's from Dublin, Ireland. She's a visual artist and working in Dublin and London. She's a PhD candidate at London Graduate School, completed her MA in Contemporary Art Theory at Goldsmiths University in London in 2010. Her work explores the role of the artist in production and effective dynamics between subjects and objects of attraction. Cultural histories. So we'll see recent pieces, and I want to let Alice actually be able to tell you about those. So can you hear me? You know that. You can start.
Okay.
All right.
Can you hear me good? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just beginning with a quote from an introduction to Non Marxism, which was by Francois Laruelle, which was published in English this year, translated by Anthony Paul Smith. So, yeah, okay. So a conjuncture is not the way an empiricist takes the object of an historical sort of discipline, but it is an experimental way of taking that object. Rather than intratemporal determination, it is it's a structure of mixture, sometimes a knot or chiasmus. The conjuncture form is universal or univocal for every particular case that presents itself within a dominant historical character. But it is universal qua its identity, which is only emergent in the last instance of that conjuncture. So what I'm about to present to you here are a series of notes in film. Notes on making, on the production of film, of fiction, and of farce, through different forms of collaboration, taking objects and subjects' thoughts and realities as materials. The film contains performances and interviews with the comedians People Pekin and Saidu Temperature, alongside a recording and some questions I asked and footage taken on a tour of the Memorial Garden in the Sierra Leone Peace Museum in Freetown, 2014. Can everyone hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay, good. If you're wondering what it is I take from non-philosophy, it is not the sense of fidelity to it or a reliance on it as a set of orthodox principles, but rather as a set of lenses, filters, or ways of seeing myself and the people I work with, as well as the methods and the work we produce together. The lenses of non-philosophy in this situation are a tool that help me to undermine those anthropological structures that might dominate such delicate and precarious relationships. I would say that if Suhail Malik is suspicious of the indeterminacy of a contemporary art that depends on its receiving subject for its completion in a kind of aestheticized neoliberal democracy oriented by its viewer consumer experience, I am curious about the radically underdetermined aesthetics offered by Laruelle's non-standard thought and in the testing and production of a methodology for an arts practice that is non-contemporary or at least non-standard in the thoughts and economies it can produce. Practically, this means a kind of locating of limiting conditions. So places where I'm spread most thin in my knowledge and ability, and where I feel more powerless and undermined. In the case of what you're going to see, it's going and working in a place that has no cultural, that my work has no cultural capital in, and contemporary art, as I've been taught to understand it, has no currency, where my sculptures become props, kind of genericized art objects that can be produced, reproduced, simulated in potentially infinite variations. Using minimal storyboards, minimal direction, and entirely improvised performances, and where the film tries to lay bare the means of its own production. The fractured and inconsistent narratives you will see are the lasting impressions of a time I felt radically inadequate, both personally and in my role as a producer of art, yet persisted in that inadequacy, for better or for worse. The simple story, which you'll see condensations of here, was filmed on location, and in a location where agricultural labour and mutual aid form the only kind of social support working people can rely on, and where comedy and musical performance are the most commonly used materials to concentrate around the problems of a very palpable structural inequality, and where I found many of the concepts which appear in the books I read tested and made hyperbolically visible and played out in the extreme in ordinary life. It should be noted here that I chose not to use any subtitling in an attempt to create a place where images, language, and sound can be equalized, in a way seeking to create textures of sense, sensuousness, and nonsense to undermine the authority of the translation, as the eye is so often drawn away from the strange to read what is familiar, undetermined there, and therefore more visible, usually printed in white at the bottom of the screen. So if you'd like to play the film now, Tony, and if you can still hear me. Play.
Password, Alice. Getting ready for that. And then, yeah, so I will start the film for us in here, and then we can finalize it with a final discussion and questions. Okay, sure. Okay. So it's a 10-minute clip. All right. So we should move away. We'll be muted, so we're going to watch it now. You won't see it. Just us watching.
Hi.
All right, we have a person in the audience right now asking. All right. Continue.
I can't hear you so well at all. Would it be possible for someone to type the questions into the sidebar if they're synopsizable?
More towards then.
Is that a big ask? I'm sorry, I really can't hear in that room at all.
Being the means by which we get towards some sort of truth of things. This common sense tension about, the ideal, the real, the material, these sorts of things. If the eminent and the transcendent are something that actually need to be put into and if this may be something the way that Laruelle tries to do through his use of the generic, and then kind of bring that back into the immanent moment. Not really sure about that. And then I guess the other thing has to do maybe with this notion of like superposition, which is brought up by Tony and how it related to the trans of Zalman. And I guess when I think about the sort of transmodern and the transversal, there's a particular procedure there. The opposite. And this sort of like hovering over of the kind of like obstacles allows you to sort of construction, which through this actualizing the problem in sort of like local obstacles that one arrives at a more sort of the one phrase to the relation to one another. And some of this also relates to the sort of idea of eminence versus transcendence. But yeah, I don't know how to get that to a whole cohesive question at this point, because at this point I really, really need some dinner. So I'm hopefully somebody can pick something up of that.
I can answer the first part of your question. In terms of Laruelle's relationships with Deleuze, and Deleuze's definition of himself as a transcendental empiricist. For me, and I think what I said transcendental in Deleuze's transcendental empiricism. Like it seems like it's an elaboration of the transcendental empiricism. Because he does these transcendental operations, but doesn't necessarily call them as such. So I think that the weak or the naive people have criticized the strength is different from Deleuze. Does that make sense?
No, but like I said, I need some dinner, so.
You want to try something?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's part of, my issues with Laruelle is that the importance of the advent of the it's a question because of how and what he does to eminence, whether he actually makes eminence keep the transcendental and get the best things from it, that he seems to be doing in a way. But the issue there is, of course, what's the strong claim still making to eminence, always being in one world, this idea of the oneness, right? So, of what's the sort of contained in regards to the monism or the immanence he's talking about. If there's just this one world, how is it we can even difference ourselves from what we're thinking to the extent we can make, even non-philosophical claims? That's why I think, Zell is important because it's similar in terms of there's immanence and fundamental is that, the conditions which, are emphasized so that we can talk about the actions that we've been transcendent, but they're also not blocked in by any exterior barrier. The kinds of actions we can do, and that things are composed of actions in this unbound sense, or is it, I think, more Laruelle about, again, like rallying things back to the real? So this last instance, as opposed to this, wager transcendental, I think they come from a similar place, but the way they operate is different. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think there's kind of, it seems like there's a sort of this sameness between the two. I don't know, but
I kind of have a question, maybe. I think, okay, so first some general comments. There was a question about whether Anne Francois was understanding her. I think that's very clear, but I don't know if she specifically says non-disciplinary object, does she?
Yeah.
She does. Okay. Then there's probably a specific way that she means that, because she's coming at it from the space of epistemology, so it's not an object is not that the object doesn't have its primary understanding. So that's something that I think could kind of be read as a corrective object of ontology or something like that. Your mode of access to it is mediating. I sort of have my reading of Laruelle, maybe people have problems with, but I kind of have problems with Tom's reading of Laruelle, so that's fine. But I'm just, trying to think of them as non-philosophy as an aesthetics, I think is a problem, because he tries to think of it as a science. And so are you then sort of trying to read aesthetics as a science? And how is it that you're understanding the term aesthetics? Because, I recently went back to yesterday, Osborne's book Anywhere or Not at All on contemporary art, which and the trajectory of the concept of aesthetics from going from him through general romanticism, etc. I think is fairly robust, and he sees it as a sort of confusion between the terms aesthetics and art. Because with Kant, you have this sort of initial move to view aesthetics as a form of the sensible element. Space and time is an aesthetic, so it has a rational component built into it. But throughout modernism, there's an attempt to sort of divorce this, right? And conceptual art was attempted to somehow correct. Sort of inbuilt into it because it's that remainder of the object photograph of the index. But I guess so I guess this is my question then. It's like how then would art be an aesthetics of the ideal, and how are you understanding aesthetics? I mean, yeah, if our sort of historical Western reception of aesthetics is based on this kind of fancier, of course. Rational agency involved, it's judgment, right? But then what does it mean to have art as an aesthetic practice if aesthetics is understood to be discourse about it?
Well, artists are not philosophers. You know, I think they start flippant or anything, but
Sure.
I don't think I would see aesthetics as a science. But I think my reading of Laruelle it's a misreading. It's an intentional. My reading of Laruelle is an intentional misreading, just like the Rastafarians' reading of the King James Bible is an intentional misreading.
Sure.
And by that notion, I'm actually enacting an underdetermined, transversal, generic kind of categorical switching.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess you could make a wager that, yeah, I mean, if you were to understand it as an aesthetics, then I think it would need to be on the basis of this initial postulation of Kant that, you know, the aesthetic is a sensible element with the knowledge, and then how does that play out in Laruelle? Because he's in fact like different from Deleuze, you know, it's not about the simulacrum for her. I mean, for him, it's you know, he's positioning it specifically against the philosophy of simulacra. It's based on the notion of philosophical modelization, so it's simulation, which I think is different. Don't have access to his experiencing subjects. The only thing that has access to that is a simulated subject for him.
Do you see that as an idealism? Do you see his as a weak idealism?
No, I don't see it as a naive empiricism either. But you know, I think this has more to do with what Venice, the switching back and forth with philosophical methodologies or genres or something. And, you know, Laruelle, I think, is very aware that is hermetic. You know, it's not hermetic, so they're not.
Right.
You can't just say you're a materialist and then sort of articulate a materialist position without also, you know, his power of his critique of philosophy is to sort of note that in an arbitrary way, because then you can't just simply mix elements together and say that you're doing something underdetermined, because if you simply hybridize things without conceptualizing, you know, it's something that doesn't explain it.
Right. But you could say that something that doesn't explain anything is exactly what you want if it's active representation. You know what I mean?
But is there an active representation? I mean, what does that mean?
I think active representation is kind of an idealist concept. I mean, when Ben said he was going to talk about idealism, I thought, wow, that's kind of really interesting because like nobody's talking about it. It's like how, you know, to talk about the idealism. And I think that Laruelle is an idealist. I don't think he's a realist. And that's why it's more helpful for me as somebody who's like involved with, you know, pictures of, is to think about his philosophy as an aesthetic. It's a willful misreading. I think he would understand it. I don't think he would discount my willful misreading of his philosophy. In a way, I'm reading Laruelle in an anti-idealist way, if that makes sense. I'm reading it more in terms of just
maybe science. That's an answer to your question, sorry.
There's a way towards answering.
Well, I can speak in allegorical terms, and the best examples I can give, are, like examples of other artists, because I can't buy my own cheese. So if I'm representing myself as my method, then I'm kind of like, I'm not really doing art. And that's why I brought up Eliot and his use of the genre of, the church, emptying it out, refilling it in a kind of this empirical, this kind of naive empiricism to, and the reason why I started with the Rancière quote is he talked about decorum as felt and as a voice. I mean, it's like the sophist's argument has a voice, and the voice and the feltness is a phenomenal. It's kind of like this byproduct of and I was trying to connect it to the transversal of, taking these categories and category switching, but getting something else yielding from the category switching that actually has a kind of a phenomenological
quote from Laruellean. I've been trying to feed her, but she's picking up a few words.
Okay, hello, sorry. So I've just I was listening to the questions. I thought it might be useful to do a little bit of a science of which is in the concept of dual language edition. So what I was talking about here, he's just kind of introducing what the philosophical engagement with the photograph, and this is where he kind of articulates what he feels like a traditionalist feels to the art image. I'm just going to read what is introduced as the scientific distinctions, and this is where he kind of starts to plot out what he sees as a science of photography. So I'm just going to read this. I don't claim to be able to interpret it perfectly for everyone at this hour, which is 2:15 in the morning here, but I'll go on. Okay, so ultimately the scientific distinctions are as follows. 1. Causality ceases to be that of the object over the image. It would then be both intelligible and amphibological, to become that of an identity in the last instance over the sole being or the sole reality of the image, that is, being in photo in parenthesis. 2. Semblance ceases to be understood from outside as resemblance of the image to that which it represents. Resemblance is dissociated unequally or unilaterally between A, the power of semblance proper to every image as such, which it is given, being the same thing as it is as its infinite identity, and B, the representational content, which is invariant but reduced to the state of symbolic support for the image. Okay, a science generally dissociates causality and semblance, and within the latter, a pure power of semblance or of appearance from the representational content. From this precisely distinguishes between apparition and the transcendent thing that appears, and in the former between semblance or appearance and the invariant representational given. Okay, I think I'll stop there. I don't know if it might be an interesting contribution. I also felt that Tom's response, from what I could hear, was
Okay. Thank you.
Really
Actually, we heard the majority of we did not willingness to work, which is better than normal. But it's good anyway to where we're actually. So, is anybody else got anything to add? Everybody will say no. I mean,
We should continue out.
yeah.
Yes.
So, it's late for you.
Thank you, everyone.
We're going to finish with we'll continue online. We'll write you. I'm already